Before we can really start editing together our fight scene, we need to have a solid understanding of exactly how it's supposed to flow. Often, the director will shoot a wide master shot, and this will be our guide. So, what is a master shot? A master shot is a film recording of an entire dramatized scene from start to finish, from an angle that keeps all the players in view. It is often a long shot and can sometimes perform a double function as an establishing shot. So, in the case of this fight scene, our master shot will show the actors or stuntmen perform the whole fight from start to finish in one continuous take. And lucky for us, the director filmed 3 master shots, all from slightly different camera angles and distances. I'm going to load up one of these shots from scene 10E take 1, which you can find at the very beginning of camera roll A17. In this shot, the fight is actually being performed by 4 stuntmen instead of the actual actors. Now, we're going to break down the fight by listing out the key moments and actions in the order in which they occur. We'll refer to this list as our beat sheet. A beat sheet will do 3 things for us. First, it's going to provide the outline of the fight and serve as a sort of roadmap to help guide us as we're editing the fight together from all the different takes and angles later on. Second, the beat sheet is going to help us make sure that we respect the choreography and we're staying true to the fight as it was originally designed by the stunt choreographer. This is almost always a good idea because those guys are the real experts and they know exactly how they intended for the scene to flow. It's our task as the editor to do a good job telling the non-verbal story they've designed through the choreography of the fight. And third, the beat sheet is going to prevent us from getting overwhelmed. Once we start editing and getting really involved in putting the fight together, it's common to feel a little lost or confused, trying to keep track of all the events that are happening and trying to keep everything moving in the right direction and in the right order. Being overwhelmed can lead to sloppy editing, as we try to just get something done quickly because it seems like too much to deal with otherwise. The beat sheet is going to help us stay focused on each step one at a time and on the editing process itself, since we won't have to be mentally keeping track of everything else that's coming up next. As we go through each moment, I'd recommend that you grab yourself a few things. First, a piece of paper and a pencil to write down these moments so you can refer to them later. Or, alternatively, you can print them out from a simple choreography beat sheet that I typed up. The file is called mastershot_beatsheet.txt, and you can find it in the Lesson Resources folder and the subfolder for this lesson, Analyzing the Master Shot. Now, this master shot is picking up after the initial confrontation between the thugs and the couple. Dan and Erica have been told to get into the warehouse, and the tension is pretty high at this point. So, just to make sure that we're all clear about who's here in this group, we have Rollins here on the far left. Then we have TT. Here you can see Erica's face over TT's shoulder. Next is Dan. And finally, there's Mouth on the far right. Alright, so let's run through the key moments of the fight. Starting at the beginning, we have Dan grabbing Rollins' wrist. Then, as Dan looks back at Erica, Rollins sucker punches him. Dan punches back. TT kicks Dan in the stomach. And punches Dan to the ground. Next, Erica is thrown to the ground. Then we see the thugs kicking Dan as he's on the ground. Alright, so then Dan somehow knocks TT down, though in this master shot, it's a little hard to see exactly how he does it. Dan then follows up with an uppercut and hits Mouth. Then we have TT, who's back up off the ground now, as he kicks Dan in the back onto the ground. Then TT picks Dan up. Dan breaks TT's elbow, or at least locks it up somehow. Then Dan hits TT and throws TT to the ground. Alright, so next we have a bit of a scuffle between Dan, Mouth, and Rollins. And to keep it simple, I'm just going to write Dan attacks Mouth. And Dan attacks Rollins. Then TT's back up again and grabs Dan from behind. Dan escapes, and he knees TT in the face. So at this point, you can see that the fight continues for a couple more moves, and then the director calls for the action to stop, and he asks the stuntmen to reset.
Go back on top, please. Go back. Reset.
You can see that they go through pretty much the same moves for another take, even though it's not reslated as one. The director calls reset again, and we pick back up around the point where Dan was kneeing TT in the face. So let's just continue from there and see what else happens in the fight. Okay, so after the knee, Dan fights with Rollins and Mouth a bit more. And it's a little chaotic, so we're just going to keep the description vague for now. The next key moment, though, is when Dan flips Rollins onto the ground. Then we have TT back up off the ground again. I guess he's a pretty resilient guy. And he punches Dan. Now, a quick note here. I know from watching the final film and having worked with the rest of this footage already, that the first attack that TT throws here to Dan isn't actually a punch. He's pretending to hit Dan over the head with an empty bottle. In the other shots of this part of the fight, we'll see footage of that actually happening, and we'll work it into the scene. But for now, we'll stay true to this process of going through the master take, and we'll just leave the description as is, with punches and kicks. Alright, so next we have TT kicking Dan a bit more. Dan blocks the kicks. Then Dan punches TT twice. And Dan does a spinning hook kick to TT's face. And that's it. That's the end of the fight. So, watching and analyzing this master shot has really given us a solid overview of how this fight scene is supposed to flow. You'll find that watching a master shot in any genre of editing can help you really get quickly familiar with a scene and start developing a good plan for editing it. If you took notes of the various stages of this fight, hang on to those because you're going to need them later. If you didn't, you'll definitely want to print out a copy of the text file we supplied and keep it handy. Coming up in the next lesson, we're going to dive into the raw footage and start arranging all of our shots using subclips. See you in a bit.